All right, strap yourselves in for this one, because today we're going deep on something pretty unique.
Oh.
Yeah, a horror story.
Okay.
But get this.
All right.
It was written and published by a 12-year-old.
Wow.
I know, right? Animated Nightmares, it's called, by Mark Ali.
12 years old.
12.
Yeah.
Like, I was still trying to figure out how to, ride a bike without training wheels at that age.
Right. I mean, that's incredible to have that kind of imagination and the drive to actually write and publish a book.
Yeah, and it's not just the book. He's also gone and founded his own media company, M Studios.
Really? At 12? That's amazing.
Let's talk about ambitious, right?
It really speaks to kind of a modern understanding of media and how to get your work out there.
Absolutely. And we're not talking like some children's book here, Animated Nightmares. This thing dives headfirst into some serious horror.
Yeah.
You got creatures like R.I.B.S, which is this time-traveling monstrosity.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there's VOF, which stands for Vines of Flesh. Yeah. And if that wasn't enough, there's this thing called TOWCAN that can actually like hijack your mind.
Those are some pretty intense concepts, especially for a 12-year-old to be exploring.
Right. Where does this kid come up with this stuff?
It's fascinating to think about what might be influencing his imagination.
So the story itself basically follows this kid named Gray, who's searching for his missing brother Daniel.
Okay.
And this search leads them to this abandoned animation studio, which, get this, turns out to be owned by their old teacher, Mr. Scar.
Oh.
Yeah. And from what I gather, Mr. Scar is not exactly the warm and fuzzy type.
So there's some like past trauma woven into this whole thing.
Layers upon layers of creepy is what it sounds like.
That animation studio setting is really interesting to me.
Yeah. How so?
Well, on one hand, it's like this place of imagination and creativity, where dreams come to life.
Yeah, I see that.
But Mark takes that and completely flips it, turning it into this breeding ground for nightmares.
Right. It's like taking something that should be safe and happy and twisting it into something.
Exactly. It's a classic horror trope, but he does it really effectively.
Yeah, like even your happy place can turn against you. And speaking of turning against you, let's dig into these creatures a bit more.
Okay.
They're not just random monsters, Each one seems to tap into some pretty specific fear, like he's pulling these anxieties right out of his own head.
That makes sense, especially considering his age. Childhood is full of these very specific fears and anxieties that adults might not even think about anymore.
Right, like being afraid of the dark or monsters under the bed.
Exactly. And Mark seems to be taking those primal fears and giving them form with these creatures.
Okay, so let's take VOF, for example. The Vines of Flesh. Imagine being a kid and feeling trapped or overwhelmed by something.
Right.
That's kind of what VOF embodies. It's like this suffocating presence that clings to you and won't let go.
It's a very visceral fear, the idea of being physically restrained or consumed by something.
Totally. And then you've got TOWCAN, which is hijacking people's minds.
Yeah, it's interesting how that taps into our modern anxieties about technology and, social media and how it can feel like it's controlling us.
Right. It's like even as adults, we worry about those things. So imagine how much more intense that fear would be for a 12-year-old.
Absolutely. It's like he's taking that feeling of being manipulated and externalizing it in this really terrifying way.
And what's really mind-blowing is that he manages to weave these complex ideas into a story that's still, a fast-paced horror story.
It's not just some philosophical treatise on the nature of fear. It's actually a gripping and entertaining read.
Exactly. He doesn't get bogged down in the heavy stuff. He keeps the story moving and keeps you on the edge of your seat.
It's impressive to see that kind of balance in a writer, especially one so young.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he's only 12 and he's already doing all of this, writing a horror novel, founding a media company, building a website,
it makes you wonder what he's going to accomplish next, right? What does his future hold?
I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of Mark Ali.
I'd be willing to bet on that.
Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the story itself, I want to hear from you out there. What are your initial thoughts on this 12-year-old author and his dive into the world of horror? Have you ever thought about the specific anxieties that might haunt a young mind? The kind of fears that could give birth to creatures like R.I.B.S. or VOF?
So we're back, diving deeper into Animated Nightmares, trying to unravel the mysteries and anxieties that Mark's woven into this story.
Yeah, like I still can't get over the fact that he's only 12.
It's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
Totally. So let's get into the story itself. It starts off pretty simply. Gray, our protagonist, is in a classroom, but Mark doesn't waste any time. Like right away, he throws in this flashback to a traumatic event from Gray's past, something involving this mysterious Mr. Scar.
Ah, so that's how he introduces that element of dread right from the beginning.
Exactly. It's not like a full-blown memory dump or anything. It's more like a quick glimpse.
Yeah.
A shadowy figure, a feeling of unease, just enough to let you know that something's not right, even in a place that should be safe, like a school.
It's a really effective way to set the tone, don't you think?
Totally, and that feeling of unease just keeps building from there, especially when Gray and his friends start searching for his missing brother, Daniel, and they end up at that creepy, abandoned animation studio.
Right. The studio itself becomes almost like a character in the story, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. It's this place that should be full of life and creativity, but instead it's filled with decay and darkness. It's almost like...
A visual representation of how childhood innocence can be corrupted.
Exactly. Like how easily something that should be pure and good can turn into something sinister.
Then that ties back to what we were saying earlier about those specific childhood fears, right?
Yeah.
The things that seem scary and threatening when you're young, but that adults might not even give a second thought to.
Right. And you know what else strikes me about Gray? He's not some fearless hero. He's a kid who's clearly burdened by his past. He's dealing with guilt and fear and all these other emotions that make him feel very real and vulnerable.
Absolutely, and that's what makes the horror so effective. We're not just watching some generic character fight monsters, we're experiencing those fears through Gray's eyes. It becomes a much more personal and intimate kind of horror.
Totally. And speaking of those monsters, let's talk about how Mark brings them to life.
Okay.
Like R.I.B.S, for example. It's not just a time-traveling creature. It's described as this monstrosity, something inherently wrong, a perversion of nature.
He takes something that could be fascinating, like the idea of time travel, and turns it into something grotesque and disturbing.
Yeah, it's like he's tapping into that fear of the unknown, the fear of forces that are beyond our control.
Forces that we can't understand or predict.
Exactly. And then there's VOF, the Vines of Flesh.
Oh, yeah, those are creepy.
The imagery is so vivid and disturbing. It's like he's taken nature, something that's supposed to be beautiful and life-giving, and turned it into this symbol of suffocation and entrapment.
It's that contrast that makes it so unsettling, right? We have this inherent trust in nature, but VOF disrupts that trust, showing us how easily even the familiar can become a source of horror.
And what about TOWCAN, that mind-controlling entity? I mean, it's like he's tapping into our growing fear of technology, the idea that we're losing control of our own thoughts and actions, becoming puppets to algorithms and unseen forces.
Right. It's a very contemporary fear, and I think it's especially potent for a young audience. Think about how much of their lives are mediated through technology. The idea of something invading their minds, taking away their agency, it must be terrifying.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to our own anxieties about the digital age, asking us to question how much control we really have.
And he does it all within the framework of this fast-paced, suspenseful horror story. There's a real mastery of pacing and tension building here. He knows when to hold back, when to drop a hint, and when to unleash the full horror.
Oh, yeah. There's this one scene in the book where Gray and his friends are trapped in an elevator, and it's just claustrophobic and terrifying. The way Mark uses sensory details, you can practically feel the walls closing and the darkness pressing down on you.
He really excels at creating atmosphere. You're right, he doesn't rely on those cheap jump scares. He builds a sense of dread, slowly and methodically drawing you into the character's fear and desperation.
And he's not afraid to get gruesome either. There are moments of violence and bloodshed that are genuinely shocking. It's clear that Mark understands the visceral impact of horror, that it's not just about scaring you intellectually, it's about affecting you on a primal level.
Absolutely. But what's interesting is that amidst all the horror and darkness, there's also this glimmer of hope. Gray, despite being terrified, shows real courage. He's determined to save his brother, and he refuses to give in to despair, even when things seem hopeless.
Yeah, it's like even in the darkest of nightmares, he clings to that bond of family, that sense of responsibility for his brother. It's a powerful message reminding us that even in the face of fear, there's still room for love and loyalty.
And that's what elevates animated nightmares beyond just a typical horror story. It becomes a story about facing your fears, about the importance of family, and about the resilience of the human spirit.
Yeah, and all of this from a 12-year-old. It really makes you wonder what goes on in that kid's head. Like, is he tapping into some universal well of fear, or is he channeling something unique to his own experience? And what does it say about our culture that a 12-year-old is writing about such dark and disturbing themes? Okay, so we're back, and We've talked about the creatures, the setting, even the psychology of it all. But you know what keeps coming back to me?
What's that?
Like, what's the message here? What's Mark trying to say with all of this? Is it just a scary story, or is there something deeper going on?
Well, I definitely think it's more than just jump scares and gore. You know, it's like he's giving us a glimpse into the anxieties of our time, but seen through the eyes of a 12-year-old.
Right, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
Exactly, like how he takes these big, complex ideas and makes them relatable, even terrifying.
You mentioned anxieties of our time. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about TOWCAN for a second.
Yeah.
You know, that creature that can, like, hijack people's minds and control their thoughts and actions. It's a pretty clear reflection of our fears about technology, isn't it? Social media algorithms, the whole feeling that we're constantly being manipulated by these unseen forces.
It's like that saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Exactly. And it's even more disturbing when you think about it from a kid's perspective. You know, they've grown up in this hyper-connected world, so that fear of losing control must be even more intense for them.
Absolutely. And it's not just about technology either, right? Like, Mark also digs into the whole idea of trauma and how past experiences can really stick with you.
Right, like Gray's whole journey is shaped by that event with Mr. Scar. It's this constant reminder that childhood wounds can have a lasting impact.
It's like the animation studio itself, you know? This place that should be full of life and creativity becomes this symbol of decay and fear.
Yeah.
It's like a visual representation of how innocence can be corrupted, how easily something that should bring us joy can turn into something monstrous.
And yet, even with all the darkness, there's this spark of hope. You know, Gray's determination to save his brother, his refusal to give up. It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, especially in young people.
And we can't forget the bigger picture here, right? Mark's not just writing a story. He's building a whole media empire with M Studios. He's got a website, a blog, YouTube channels. The kid's an entrepreneur.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. He understands that in today's world, you have to be a multi-platform creator, you know? To build a brand, connect with your audience in different ways. He's not just writing a book, he's creating a whole world.
And it makes you wonder what he'll do next. If this is what he's capable of at 12, imagine what he'll be creating in 5, 10 years.
Yeah, I have a feeling we'll be hearing his name a lot more in the future. He's definitely one to watch.
So what's the takeaway here? What do we want our listeners to remember about Animated Nightmares and Mark Ali?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is this. Don't underestimate the power of young minds, you know? Mark's story is proof that age is no barrier to creativity, to ambition, to tackling complex ideas.
Absolutely.
And for anyone out there who enjoys a good scare, Animated Nightmares is definitely worth checking out. But beyond the horror, there is a depth and sophistication that will really stay with you.
Totally. And if you're curious to see what else this young creative force is up to, check out M Studios online. You can find links to his blog, YouTube channels, all that good stuff.
Maybe you'll even be inspired to unleash your own inner storyteller. That's what it's all about, right? Inspiring the next generation of creators. And who better to do that than a 12-year-old who's already taking the world by storm?
So thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, another chance to explore the ideas and stories that shape our world. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never be afraid to face your own animated nightmares.